Nobody in the village of Crestholm paid much attention to the boy who lived at the end of the narrow dirt road. He was quiet, he was plain, he wore the same gray coat in summer as he did in winter, and he walked with his head slightly down, as if he was always thinking about something the rest of the world could not see. His name was Eli Wren. His mother was a seamstress who worked until her fingers bled, and his father had died in a quarry accident before Eli could remember his face. There was nothing about this boy, on the surface, that would make anyone stop and stare. And yet, something about Eli Wren was different. It was not something you could point to. It was not a scar, or a strange mark, or an unusual height. It was more of a feeling. When Eli walked into a room, the room changed. Not loudly, not dramatically. It simply became quieter, more focused, as if the air itself had decided to pay attention. Even the dogs in the village, which barked at strangers and snapped at children, would grow still when Eli passed by. They would watch him with calm, curious eyes, then lower their heads. The other children in Crestholm did not know what to make of him. A boy named Darrow, the blacksmith's son, made it his daily project to remind Eli of his low place in the world. Darrow was loud, broad, and always surrounded by friends who laughed at whatever he said. He called Eli the ghost boy, and threw mud on his coat, and knocked the bread from his hands in the market lane. Eli never raised his voice, he never cried. He would simply pick up whatever had been thrown down, dust it off, and continue walking. It drove Darrow mad in a way that nothing else could. One afternoon, Darrow blocked Eli's path in the village square, and puffed out his chest, the way roosters do before a fight. "You going to say something one day, ghost boy?" he said. "Or are you just going to float around looking sad forever?" Eli looked at him. Not with anger, not with fear, just with clear, steady eyes that seemed to see straight through the performance Darrow was putting on. "I have nothing to prove to you," Eli said simply. Then he stepped around him and walked on. It was 12 words. But Darrow stood there for a long moment, and for reasons he could not explain, he never bothered Eli again. The years passed the way years do in small villages, slowly, and then all at once. When Eli was 14, the rains came hard, and the river that ran behind the lower homes flooded its banks. It happened in the middle of the night. People woke to cold water rising through their floors. Children screamed. Old men tried to move furniture to higher ground. The village was in chaos. Eli woke to the sound. He did not panic. He pulled on his boots, walked out into the dark, and began working. He carried an elderly woman on his back through water that reached his chest. He waded back in 3 more times, pulling 2 children and a man with a bad leg to safety before the water rose further. He moved without stopping, without asking for thanks, without any of the noise that surrounded the other rescuers. By morning, when the water began to pull back, 6 people sat safe on the hill above the village, and all of them had been brought there by the boy in the gray coat. The healer of Crestholm, an elderly woman named Marin, was watching from the hill. She had lived long enough to have seen strange things. Droughts that broke on the exact day prayers were spoken, wolves that turned away from livestock for no reason, storms that split around certain trees. She had learned not to explain these things, only to notice them. As Eli carried the last man up the slope that morning, she saw something on his left forearm, a shape visible only for a moment, like a pattern beneath the skin, glowing faintly in the early light. It looked like a wolf mid-howl. She said nothing, but she began to watch the boy very carefully. By the time Eli was 16, he had become something the village depended on, without ever officially deciding to. The baker trusted him to open the stall before dawn. The elder on the village council asked his thoughts before meetings, even though Eli had no seat there and no right to one. When 2 neighboring families argued over land, a dispute that had lasted 11 years, they both, separately and without coordination, went to Eli and asked him to listen. He did, and when he spoke, he said something so fair and so clear that both families nodded and shook hands the same afternoon. None of this made sense by any rule anyone knew. He had no education beyond what his mother had taught him. He had no land, no money, no family name that carried any weight. He was a commoner in every sense the word contained. And yet people trusted him the way they trust good weather, instinctively, without needing a reason. The moment that changed everything came when Eli was 19. A nobleman's caravan was passing through Crestholm on its way to the capital city of Eldenmere. Lord Casson was a high official of the crown, a man used to being obeyed and not often surprised by anything. His caravan was moving along the ridge road above the village when the lead horse threw a shoe, stumbled, and panicked. It was a large animal, and when it reared up in fear, the carriage behind it tilted toward the edge of the ridge. The drop on the other side was steep and rocky. The other horses began to pull in different directions, and the coachman had already lost his grip. Eli was on the ridge road returning from a delivery. He saw it happen in real time. He dropped the sack he was carrying, crossed the distance at a run, grabbed the lead horse by the bridle with both hands, and planted his feet. The horse pulled. Eli held. The animal was enormous and terrified, its eyes white with fear, its hooves tearing at the dirt road. Eli did not pull back hard. He simply held firm, kept his breathing steady, and spoke to the horse in a low, even voice. Within a minute that felt like 10, the horse slowed, then stopped, then stood still beside Eli, breathing hard but calm. Lord Casson stepped out of the tilted carriage with shaking hands. He was a composed man by nature and profession, but his face was gray. He looked at the edge of the ridge. Then he looked at the boy standing in the road, covered in dust, one hand still resting on the horse's neck. "What is your name?" Lord Casson asked. "Eli Wren, my lord," the boy answered. Casson looked at the worn boots, the plain coat, the absence of any emblem or house mark. "Wren," he repeated slowly. "No house?" "No, my lord, just Wren." Casson was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his coat and produced a coin. He placed it in Eli's hand. But as the caravan moved on, Casson leaned back in his seat and wrote something in the small notebook he always kept on his person. That night, when he arrived in Eldenmere, he submitted a formal report to the palace office. The report said simply, "There is a commoner in Crestholm worth watching." 3 months later, Eli received a letter he did not expect. It was sealed with the crown's mark and written in formal language that took him a while to read through. The Kingdom of Eldenmere, the letter explained, was conducting a civic talent survey, identifying skilled individuals of common birth for possible service roles in the capital. He was requested to present himself at the palace testing grounds. His mother read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully and placed it on the table. "You don't have to go," she told him. "I know," he said, "but I think I should." He arrived in the capital city, looking exactly as he always looked. No fine clothes, no horse. He walked in through the general entrance with a worn leather satchel over one shoulder, and the first guard he met looked him up and down with undisguised doubt. The testing hall was full of other candidates, sons of craftsmen and merchants and minor officials, many of them well-dressed and confident. They eyed each other the way competitors do. Eli found a bench at the edge of the room and sat quietly. The first trial was physical. Candidates were asked to spar with trained soldiers in short rounds, not to win, but to demonstrate composure and capability. Most candidates fought with energy and noise. Some were skilled, a few were very good. When Eli's turn came, he stepped onto the floor without any visible preparation. The soldier assigned to him was experienced, and not gentle about it. He came in fast and low. Eli moved sideways, not backward, sideways. He let the force pass him, redirected the soldier's arm with the lightest possible touch, and stepped into a position where the soldier found himself off balance and facing the wrong direction. It happened so quickly that the judges watching barely tracked it. The soldier regrouped and came again. The same result, and again. Eli never used more force than was needed. He seemed to understand exactly where the other person was going before they got there. The second trial was different. A group of actors were placed in a courtyard to simulate a public conflict. Raised voices, shoving. The kind of scene that could become dangerous if not handled quickly. Candidates were sent in one at a time and given no instructions other than to resolve it. Most of them shouted. One used physical force. One tried to bargain and made it worse. When Eli entered the courtyard, he stopped in the center of the noise, stood still, and waited. He did not shout over the chaos. He did not try to grab anyone or issue commands. He just stood there, still, calm, present. One by one, the actors noticed him and fell quiet, not because he ordered it, because there was something in his stillness that made the noise feel unnecessary. Within 2 minutes, the entire courtyard was silent and looking at him. He said, "Tell me what happened." And they did. The third test was not planned by anyone. It was not in any official document or training manual. It happened because King Thelric's hunting dog, a large, unpredictable animal that the palace staff quietly feared, pulled free from its handler in the middle of the testing hall and charged toward a cluster of noble observers who had come to watch the trials. The handler screamed. The observers scrambled backward. 2 guards drew their weapons. Eli stepped forward. He placed himself between the animal and the observers. He did not raise his hands or draw anything or make any sudden movement. He looked at the dog. The dog looked at him. For 3 seconds, nobody in the hall breathed. Then the dog lowered its head, walked to Eli's side, and sat down. Eli placed his hand gently on the animal's back. That was all. The hall was absolutely silent. Somewhere in the upper gallery, King Thelric, young, uncertain, surrounded by advisors who all wanted something from him, slowly set down his cup and leaned forward in his seat. That night, alone in the small stone room assigned to common candidates, Eli could not sleep. He lay on his back and stared at the ceiling, and for the first time in his life, he felt something pulling at the edges of his memory. It was not a thought exactly, it was a weight, something enormous and distant, like hearing thunder from a storm you cannot see. He felt the echo of a crown, the cold of a stone throne, the sound of 1,000 people speaking his name, but not the name Eli. He sat up. His left forearm was warm. He pushed up his sleeve. The mark beneath his skin, the one old Marin had seen years ago, was visible now, clear and steady, like a word written in a language older than the one he spoke. There was a knock at his door. He opened it, and there stood Marin. She had followed him to the capital without telling him. In her hands was a small book, old and carefully wrapped in cloth. She placed it on the table between them without a word, and opened it to a marked page. The writing was old but readable. It described a king from an age before the current kingdoms, a ruler of extraordinary power, who had governed a vast empire with an authority that was called natural, not learned. His name was recorded as Aldrich. His sigil was a wolf mid-howl, and at the bottom of the page there was a single line from a text the book described as ancient prophecy. "He who falls from the highest peak shall rise again in the lowest valley, and the earth shall remember what the flesh has forgotten." Eli read it twice. Then he sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long time. "I don't understand what I am," he finally said. Marin looked at him with the particular calm of someone who has been carrying a truth for a long time and is relieved to finally put it down. "You are what you have always been," she said. "You just had to live long enough to remember it." The days that followed changed the shape of the palace in ways that were invisible but real. Eli had been given a provisional appointment, the lowest titled role in the court, a diplomatic position that normally went to minor lords as a formality. The nobility was not pleased. They used polite language to say unpleasant things, the way powerful people often do. They called the appointment irregular. They called it a risk to the natural order. What they meant was that a boy with no name had walked into their world, and, without trying to, made many of them feel insufficient. But something else was happening at the same time. The palace guards began greeting Eli by name. The kitchen staff saved him a place at the table. The young scribes who worked the lower offices brought him questions they were afraid to ask their supervisors. Loyalty has a particular way of forming, not through commands, but through the simple act of a person treating others as worthy of their full attention. That was what Eli did, always and without ceremony, and the people around him felt it. The crisis arrived on an ordinary Tuesday. A message reached the king that 3 smaller kingdoms along the northern border had joined together and seized a key mountain pass. They were demanding payment to open the route again, or threatening to hold it indefinitely. The king's war council sat around the long table and argued for 6 hours. The generals wanted soldiers sent immediately. The diplomats wanted negotiations, but disagreed on terms. The treasury minister said the kingdom had no money for either option. The meeting ended without a decision, and the king sat at the head of the table, looking like a man standing in the middle of a river that was pulling in all directions. The following morning, in a rare open session, all appointed officials were asked to speak. Title by title, Rank by rank, they offered arguments. Some were long, some were clever. Most were shaped by whatever personal interest lay beneath them. When it was Eli's turn, the room did not exactly grow quiet, but it shifted. He stood without notes. He had, over the previous 2 weeks, quietly opened conversations with a traveling merchant who had regular contact with traders from the Northern Coalition. Not officially, not with any title behind him, just as a curious person asking careful questions. In those conversations, he had learned something important. What the three kingdoms were demanding in public, and what they actually needed were two different things. They were afraid of being overlooked by Eldenmir's expanding trade agreements. The seized pass was a message, not a plan. Eli explained this to the room in plain, clear language. He named the specific concerns. He suggested a solution that involved no soldiers and no large payment. Only a formal recognition of the Northern Kingdom's trade rights, something that cost the crown nothing but paper and ink. He finished speaking and sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Then one of the senior diplomats said slowly, "How do you know any of this?" I asked. Eli said. "4 days later, the pass was open. No soldiers had moved. No money had changed hands. The Northern Coalition sent a letter of acknowledgement to the capital, and the crisis disappeared the way a fire does when you remove what was feeding it. The story spread through the city the way good stories always do, person to person, gaining texture with each telling. A common-born boy from a village nobody had heard of had walked into the halls of Eldenmere with nothing but a worn satchel and clear eyes, and had resolved in 4 days what the king's full council had failed to resolve in 6 hours of argument. People said it was luck. Then they said it was cleverness. Then, when they ran out of small explanations, they simply said his name, Eli Wren. The way you say the name of something you have decided to accept without fully understanding. On the first night of winter, Eli stood alone on the upper ramparts of the palace. The sky was clear and enormous. The mark on his forearm was warm and steady, and the memories that had been pulling at him for weeks finally arrived all the way, not like a flood, but like tide, gradual, certain, covering ground that had always been there. He remembered a different name. He remembered a throne of dark stone. He remembered what it felt like to have power that no one could challenge, and how that feeling, though it seemed like everything from the outside, had been the loneliest thing he had ever carried. He remembered the moment before he died, the emptiness of a room where no one stood beside him as a true equal, only subjects and servants, and people who needed something from him. And he understood, standing on that rampart in a plain coat with no crown and no army, why he had been sent back, not to reclaim what was lost, not to prove anything to the world, but to learn what power looks like when it has nothing behind it. No throne, no title, no name, and still finds its way to the surface. He had spent a lifetime being overlooked and dismissed. He had carried water and bread for people who did not know his father's name. He had been called a ghost, and he had quietly, daily, chosen to show up anyway. That was the lesson. Not in the palace hall or the testing ground, but in every small, unwitnessed moment before any of it. In the years that followed, Eli Wren rose to a position that had no exact precedent in the history of Eldenmere. He became the king's first counsel, not a general, not a lord, not a man of inherited rank, but the person the king asked for before any other. He never wore a crown. He never commanded an army. He never once declared who he had been in another life, and the mark on his forearm remained private, known only to Merrin, who kept his secrets the way good people keep promises, quietly and completely. Those who worked beside him across the years all described him the same way. They used words like steady, calm, present. They said he listened better than anyone they had met, and that when he spoke, he did not waste words. They said that animals trusted him, that people opened up to him in hallways without planning to, and that in rooms full of noise and argument, he could bring stillness simply by entering. None of them could explain it fully. Some things resist full explanation. Some people carry something that the usual vocabulary was not made to describe. All anyone in Eldenmere knew for certain was that a boy who had once been called a ghost had turned out to be more real, more present, more genuinely powerful than anyone who had tried to reduce him. The world's strongest king had returned not with an army or a declaration, but with patience, with simplicity, and with a life lived fully from the ground up. And in the end, that was the only kind of strength that truly lasts.